It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And thanks for tuning in on WHP 580 AM and iHeartRadio and News Talk 104.1 FM at WEJS. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in each and every Saturday here at 1 o'clock. And also, you're welcome to watch prior podcasts of the show and take a look at some great merchandise we have, including our popular Right to Bear Arms muscle shirt and the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us yard signs and T-shirts. And you can find those at the markscaringishow.com website, where we've got lots of other interesting and fun merchandise. And then for more political and legal news throughout the course of the week, don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Well, it's been another exciting week in the world of politics and law. Both major political parties have concluded their conventions. The violence and chaos continues in Portland and in cities across the country. And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has committed quite a foible, if you will, and has exposed the hypocrisy of her support for these mask orders and these lockdown orders at a hair salon in San Francisco, of all places. But first, the conventions. We had the Democratic National Party, the Democratic National Committee's Zoom convention, which was a bizarre experience, where you had Billy Porter, the actor, musician, wearing a half dress, half business suit, dancing and singing to some music from the 1970s. And you had a series of dour and depressed speakers, including Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, who were talking about what a horrible, systemically racist country we live in, and how President Trump is the closest thing to evil in this world. It was down, it was depressing, it was strange, weird, and it was all on Zoom. It was like a Zoom call from hell, a never-ending Zoom call. And it revealed the Democratic Party to be incompetent and weak, which is what it is at its core. The Republican National Convention, by contrast, was spectacular. It was a resounding success. It was live in many parts. It concluded with the president giving his acceptance speech in a live, in-person audience. Melania Trump, the evening before, gave her acceptance or gave her nomination speech in support of her husband in front of a live audience. It was full of non-politicians, regular human beings, giving their story, why they support the president. And those stories were powerful and were moving. The lady who was pardoned by President Trump, who was serving a sentence for a lower level drug offense from decades ago, she did a fantastic job. The wife, the widow of the fallen police officer. There were so many others, from Herschel Walker and others, giving real personal stories about how President Trump's policies and actions have benefited their lives. And so it was very powerful and very moving. and I just think did a much better job than the Democrats did with their convention. And I think the Republican National Convention will mark the Trump turnaround. And you'll see the president begin to rise in the polls as a result of this very successful convention. And we have seen an interesting poll in which the president has increased his vote among black males. The poll was released shortly after the Republican National Convention, and that's been a demographic voting group that has been rather elusive to Republicans in the past 100 years or so. And Donald Trump is doing better than many past Republican presidents. And with the recent poll, he's doing even better, a significant increase in support among black male voters. So that's looking good for the president as he moves into the fall election season. We've also seen a continuation of the violence that has affected our inner cities. Portland, Oregon is a horrible example. We've seen the mayor of Portland. He has been supporting and condoning these protests, which are actually riots. At least he did until they tried to burn down his house. He lives in a condominium, and BLM and Antifa broke into the condo complex, thwarted security, lit fires in the lobby of the condominium building. There are people, there are families, there are children living in the condos in the building, yet the BLM and Antifa saw fit to start fires in the lobby. So not the most peaceful of protests. Arson is not something that is protected by our First Amendment, and certainly not advisable to engage in. And so it looks like the Portland mayor may have turned the corner there when he was threatened with the burning down of his home. But we also heard earlier this week from Her Majesty the Queen Nancy Pelosi. She had her glorious coif washed, rinsed, and blown dry at a Shishi hair salon in San Francisco earlier in the week. Now, the problem with this is Speaker Pelosi violated the local ordinance issued by the city of San Francisco, and also the quarantine order issued by California Governor Gavin Newsom, prohibiting the operations of salons. So salons were shut down in San Francisco and in California. And in San Francisco, they've been shut down for 6 months now. And apparently that city and county is one of the last in California to start to reopen its shuttered businesses. But that did not deter the fact that the quarantine law closed down hair salons, did not deter Nancy Pelosi, who has a beautiful head of hair, from having her hair done at a hair salon in San Francisco, notwithstanding the order making it a crime. Now, when confronted with her crime, and it's all on videotape, there is surveillance that the owner of the hair salon had installed many years before to videotape the goings-on within the hair salon. There's videotape of a maskless, wet-haired Nancy Pelosi moving from one area of the salon to another, followed by her stylist, who is wearing a mask, but not Nancy Pelosi. This is the woman who has scolded Donald Trump, who has scolded the Republicans, has scolded the American people for not wearing masks, yet she doesn't. And interestingly, in the press conference she had the day after the scandal erupted, where she defended herself, which we'll talk about in a little bit, she was still not wearing her mask. So at what point does Nancy Pelosi wear her mask? She is 80 years old, by the way, and so she is in that high-risk demographic group. It is remarkable that she will admonish the nation to wear a mask, yet we see her maskless. Not only maskless, but we see her violating the very quarantine laws she has scolded us for not adhering to, or at least for fighting against. So when confronted with her crime, our dear Queen Pelosi, she responded in a way that reminded me of the response that the former mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, had once given. I lived in Washington, D.C. for several years, many, many years ago, either during the Barry administration or right after. I can't remember, but I do remember the scandal quite well of Marion Barry being caught purchasing crack cocaine and smoking crack cocaine at a hotel in Washington, D.C., and he comes up with that famous line, the you-know-what set me up. I'm not going to say what the you-know-what is because I don't want to be censored by iHeartRadio. But that was Marion Barry's response to being caught for obviously committing a crime. And Nancy Pelosi was very obviously committing a crime. She violated the quarantine order. There have been Pennsylvanians who have been charged criminally for violating the Wolf stay-at-home order, which is, in essence, the quarantine order. There are Pennsylvania businesses who have suffered multiple fines, huge, significant fines, for flouting Governor Wolf's business closure order and his reopen plan. But Nancy Pelosi, she can violate San Francisco and California's quarantine order, and apparently no charges are filed. We're going to talk more about our Queen Nancy having her beautiful hair done at a salon in San Francisco when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. We're talking about Her Majesty the Queen Nancy Pelosi having her glorious coif washed, rinsed, and blown dry at that Shishi hair salon in San Francisco earlier in the week. Now, the good Queen, Nancy Pelosi, was in direct violation of the San Francisco and state of California quarantine laws that had shut down and closed the operations of that hair salon. Nancy Pelosi, when confronted with her criminal activity for violating the closure order, well, she blamed the salon. She blames the salon. She says the salon set her up, so she was framed. And at a press conference that the speaker gave the day after, she was revealed to have been in violation of state and local law. Nancy Pelosi said, "I take responsibility for trusting the word of the neighborhood salon that I've been to over the years many times, and that when they said we're able to accommodate people one person at a time, and that we can set up that time, I trusted that. As it turns out, it was a setup. So I take responsibility for falling for a setup." There you have it. That's a profile in courage. She violates the quarantine law. There is no exception in the quarantine law in San Francisco and California pertaining to hair salons for one person at a time visits or experiences. Nancy Pelosi just made that up. She wants the whole country to be under lockdown and subject to criminal prosecution for violating lockdown orders, but she herself feigns ignorance about the very orders that she is supposed to be subject to as a resident of San Francisco. So she says, well, she was entrapped, basically. She was set up because she thought they could take her one person at a time. Well, isn't that what hairstylists do? Don't they work on one customer at a time? So Pelosi is her excuse just doesn't pass the laugh test. And she just won't take responsibility for violating the quarantine law. And that's regrettable. Now, the owner of the salon, which had been closed for 6 months now due to San Francisco's disastrous quarantine law, she's the one who broke the story. Now, one of her stylists, who is an independent contractor and not an employee, booked the appointment for Pelosi and informed the owner. And the owner was apparently pretty peeved that Pelosi was arranging for special treatment for herself so that she could get her hair done while the rest of the lovely ladies of San Francisco suffered. And the owner was even more incensed that, well, Pelosi was not wearing a mask during the visit. And all of this was caught on the salon's video surveillance system. And so the owner released the video to social media, and the firestorm erupted. The owner is distraught that San Francisco is still under the lockdown for 6 months now. And her business, she said, is essentially ruined. She doesn't think it's going to survive. And there's Nancy, maskless, while condemning others for not wearing masks and violating the lockdown so that she can get her hair done while the rest of San Francisco couldn't. Now, your heart goes out to this salon owner. Her business is destroyed. Her stylists are not able to generate the money they need to feed their families. Yet Queen Nancy, with her massive government salary, her massive benefits, her security detail, she continues to live like a queen while her subjects suffer. And this is just a one anecdote that really embodies the hypocrisy of these quarantine orders, where you have governors issuing orders, locking down businesses, causing businesses to go into financial ruin, while the governor and the people working for the governor, they don't lose a dime. I mean, they continue to get their fat paychecks, their benefits, and all the perks and privileges associated with their employment. And they put these lockdown and stay-at-home orders on those of us in the private sector who have to fight and claw and scratch just to survive financially. It's a horrible fraud is what it is, and Nancy Pelosi has just exposed it once again. The orders, the lockdown orders, the shut-in orders, they pertain to the little people, to us, to the 320-some million little people in America, but not to our overlords and bosses. And Queen Nancy embodies them. And speaking of kings and queens, we have our own king here in Pennsylvania, His Majesty King Tom Wolf. Well, he's issued another royal decree. Now, he updated his recommendations concerning high school sports. The governor's new guidelines. Well, first of all, remember the governor, as recently as about a week ago, said that he recommends that all high school sports be suspended until January of next year. Well, he also had guidelines out, and apparently he has updated those recommendations or guidelines, and that's what's causing this recent bout of news stories. The governor's new guidelines pertaining to high school sports omit these two sentences that were in the original or the previous guidelines, and here they are. Sports-related activities at the PK to 12 level are limited to student athletes, coaches, officials, and staff only. Visitors and spectators are prohibited from attending in-person sports-related activities. Those are the two sentences from Governor Wolf's previous recommendation, or guideline, if you will, that he has omitted. So that's really all he did. And he's getting credit by some in the media for allowing high school sports to occur and allowing spectators to attend. He just omitted those two lines from his recommendations. Now visitors and spectators are permitted to attend, and we use this language "permitted." it's very unclear because Governor Wolf is only speaking of recommendations when he talks about his guidelines to high school athletics. But the governor still has his orders in place. His plan to reopen Pennsylvania is an executive order. And in fact, all of Pennsylvania is still under the green phase of his plan, with limits of 25 people indoors and 250 people outdoors, and the various occupancy limits and increased occupancy limits for certain businesses and industries. So we are still under this lockdown plan, at this point, with significant limits on the number of people who can gather indoors and outdoors. So on one hand, the governor says, he's just talking about guidelines and recommendations for high school athletics. Well, that may be true in one sense, but in another sense, he still has not lifted the severe restrictions that he has in his executive order that are the force of law. And that's the rub. That's the problem. So, even though the governor recommends we can now have spectators, visitors, spectating, watching high school athletic events, we're still subject to the limits. So what does that mean for indoor sports, such as volleyball, water polo, swimming? They're subject to the 25-person indoor limit. So how many people are on a volleyball team? Isn't it 6 on each side? I'm not exactly sure. I think it's 6 on each side. That's 12 volleyball players, plus the coaches, the supporting staff. You very quickly get to 25 people. Well, that's it. So in effect, that's going to mean that a whole lot of parents aren't going to be able to watch their children's indoor athletic activities this fall. That's the real effect here of the governor, of the fact that the governor still has in force these executive orders. Now, what does that mean for football? Well, it means that games are limited, or any outdoor sport this fall, and who knows for how long in the future. But we've got football coming up. We have soccer coming up. We have cross country coming up. Our kids are practicing and training right now for these athletic activities. But the governor's restrictions are still in force. They're still the force of law. And for outdoors, we can't gather more than 250 people, or we're in violation of the governor's orders and could be subject to prosecution. That's the state of the law in Pennsylvania. We're going to talk more about this particular issue in high school sports and Governor Wolf's recommendations and his orders and the confusion resulting therefrom. When we return from this brief commercial break, you're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Let's get back to The Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're talking about Governor Wolf, His Majesty the King, his recent recommendation. So I guess we can't call it an edict. It's more of a recommendation repealing part of an earlier recommendation. And it's interesting that the governor is in this recommendation and guideline phase. I wonder if he is afraid of being sued continually because we've been suing him since the very beginning of the series of executive orders that we believe infringe upon the right of liberty, the right of travel, the freedom, the right to property for the people of Pennsylvania. The governor is in this recommendation mode, but he still hasn't repealed the restrictions on our rights to travel, our right to liberty, to freedom that are set forth, that are guaranteed by the United States and Pennsylvania constitutions. A prime example of this is we're still in the green phase. And there's no end to the green phase. It's whenever the governor decides to end it. And the governor recently, by the way, renewed the disaster emergency declaration for another 90 days. So this is going to go on for at least another 90 days. And the governor's green phase still has these limits in place, 25 people indoors. You can't have more than 25 people inside a building. You can't have more than 250 people gathered together outdoors. That's still the law, if you will, of the governor's executive orders. And so when the governor kind of changes his recommendation with regard to high school sports and omits earlier language that had restricted sports-related activities to only student athletes, coaches, officials, and staff only, thus, in essence, prohibiting parents from being able to watch their children's own athletic games, the governor has now revised that language in his recommendation by omitting it. So that's what he's done. So it looks like now families, parents, visitors, and spectators are no longer prohibited by the guidelines, but we still have the executive order in place. And so that gets us to the problem we talked about: indoor athletic events, volleyball, water polo, swimming, no more than 25 people at those meets. And when you count coaches, staff, et cetera, that tallies up rather quickly. And what does it mean for football? Well, it means that football games are limited to 250 people. So good luck to the ticket salesman who has to tell a Cumberland Valley football mom or a Central Dauphin football mom, or even worse, a West Perry football mom, that she's number 251, and thus she's barred from watching her son play football. Imagine the response by that mom. I grew up in western Pennsylvania, in a suburb outside of Pittsburgh, and played football my entire young life there. And I know a thing or two about football moms and dads. And we always hear about soccer moms, and but football moms are the toughest people you'll ever meet. And I wouldn't want to be the one telling little Johnny's mother that she can't watch her son play football because she chose ticket 251. So she's one person over Governor Wolf's limit. We're seeing civil unrest in Portland and Kenosha and other cities across the country with these restrictions on the number of parents who can attend the sons and daughters' high school sporting events. I don't think we've seen nothing yet on the possible civil disobedience and civil disturbance that will arise. And come this fall, really, it's in the next couple of days or weeks as these activities start up again. I mean, it is upon us, and we're going to see how far the people of Pennsylvania will allow themselves to be pushed. Your son or daughter, they've been practicing and they've been training for months or years to participate in a sport. There's a game coming up next week, or there's a meet coming up next week, and you're too many to accommodate to fit within the governor's restrictions on indoor and outdoor gatherings. So what are you going to do? Are you going to just allow yourselves to be locked out of the stadium, locked out of the swim meet? You can't get in there. You can't see what's happening to your child. Is that what you're going to do as a parent? I guess we'll all have to confront this issue and resolve this issue. I have children in athletics, and I've got a son playing football, and I have no idea how I'm going to respond if I can't get into the stadium to watch my son play. It's just a terrible thought to even contemplate, but this is how these executive orders affect us in very real ways, shutting our businesses down, locking us in our homes, and now these ridiculous restrictions on indoor and outdoor gatherings. Nancy Pelosi, she doesn't care. she goes to the salon without wearing her mask. Governor Wolf, he doesn't care. He marches in a Black Lives Matter protest in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, at the height of the pandemic, by the way, when the stay-at-home order was still in effect. And there are parts of it that, as we've discussed, are still in effect today. And he violated his order. He was in a gathering of more than 250 people. And yet, he's okay. He can do it when he wants to do it. When he finds reason to violate the stay-at-home order, Governor Wolf will do it. When Nancy Pelosi finds reason to violate the quarantine order in San Francisco, she does it. And that's to march in a Black Lives Matter rally and to get your hair done. What about those tens of thousands of parents in Pennsylvania who want the right to be able to watch their son or daughter play in an athletic event in the next couple of weeks? We're likely going to be barred. If we exceed the limits, we're out. And it's just baffling to me that with the mortality rate of this illness being as small as it is, the coronavirus is like the mild flu to the overwhelming majority of the people who've contracted it. It's only deadly to a very small subset of a demographic group, the infirm elderly with comorbidities. And if you look at the actual death rate, it's almost so small that you can't even calculate it compared to the total population. And that's the way it's always been from day one. It has always been that way. We've been talking about that until we're red in the face in every court in Pennsylvania. That to the overwhelming majority of the people, it is, if they contract it, and if they're even aware they've contracted, because it's so mild, there's a certain good percentage of people who get it who don't even know they have it. It's like the mild flu. And for this, we are still subject to these orders. The salon in San Francisco is still closed for 6 months, closed, barred. You can't use it. Nancy Pelosi can, but you can't. And now we're looking at watching at our schools are only partially open. They have this ridiculous remote learning, which it doesn't even come close to being sufficient education for our children. We parents are allowing this to happen. It's happened to us. I have a young child. I have 4 young children, one of which started the remote learning last night, and it was an absolute joke. My child would not pay attention, was fiddling around with the computer, was looking for every excuse not to participate in this purported learning experience. This is what this remote learning is, particularly for children. Now, responsible adults and perhaps some responsible children can get something out of remote learning. But for the overwhelming majority of children, they need to be in person, in classroom, with teachers in front of their faces, disciplining them, encouraging them, admonishing them, making them do the work. That's a successful educational situation. And that's not what we have, and that's what's happening to the parents of the people of Pennsylvania and their children. And it's a sad day indeed in this Commonwealth. We're going to turn after a few minutes. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're talking about the fact that we still have restrictions on indoor gatherings and outdoor gatherings in place in Pennsylvania. We're still in the green phase. We're not out of this yet. And we've watched how the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., Nancy Pelosi, has defied the San Francisco and California version of the Pennsylvania orders. At least in Pennsylvania, actually, the hair salons, barbershops are permitted to open, albeit with certain restrictions in place on occupancy and by appointment only. In California, they're closed. Well, actually, in San Francisco and the county in which San Francisco is located, they're still closed. And I believe that's one of the last ones to have a complete shutdown on hair salons and similar businesses. But notwithstanding the quarantine order, Nancy Pelosi was able to get herself her hair done in violation of that existing order. And, of course, she doesn't take responsibility for violating San Francisco and California's quarantine orders. She says that she was set up by the hair salon owner, and that's the way she's going to respond. She's going to deflect blame onto the owner who's suffering under the orders that Pelosi has been advocating for months now. Over here in Pennsylvania, we have our own Governor Wolf, who you all know very, very well, and the various orders that he's put into place beginning in mid-March of this year to shut down and lock in the people of Pennsylvania. And the fact that we still have limitations in place, and a lot of parents across Pennsylvania are sending their children back to school this week and last week, and they're dealing with the remote learning, which is in most of our public schools. I'm not sure that any of our public schools have, at least in central Pennsylvania, have resumed with full in-person operations every day of the week, and perhaps someone will have to correct me on that. The school district that my children attend has a hybrid option where you have partial in-person, partial remote. I think the remote learning, although the teachers are wonderful and the administration is obviously well-intentioned, and no question about that, it just pales in comparison to the effectiveness of in-person, in-class instruction. And so the children will suffer the educational deficits due to this paranoia and hysteria concerning the coronavirus. We've talked about this issue so many times. I've talked about it until I'm blue in the face. The statistics have been in for months. It was well known even at the time of the issuance of the orders that the coronavirus is only deadly to a very, very small percentage, a very small subset of the demographic group. You all know this. Doesn't need to be repeated ad infinitum. Yet we still have these restrictions in place for everyone. And we're dealing now with remote learning and all of the limitations that result from remote learning, how difficult it is to capture and keep a child's attention remotely. Our teachers know how difficult it is to even do that in person in class. They already have to struggle with the natural tendency of so many children to drift off, to daydream, to not concentrate, to not focus. That has always been a part of any educational system, good or bad. That's a quality of nature that is only exacerbated when there is distance. So now we have young children trying to operate like Zoom meetings with their teachers and fellow classmates. So there's much more distance now, and there are many more distractions that are available to these children. So the remote learning has been a disaster. We experienced that in the spring. My children barely participated in it. It was as if they thought they were on spring break. And what were mom and dad doing? Well, they were trying to work. I mean, trying to continue to generate income to feed the family. And so now we have remote learning we don't have the option to send our children to school 5 days a week in the public school. If we want that option, we'd have to send our children to a private or parochial school, and of course, great expense to us, in addition to the great expense we're already paying for our public schools. So we'd be paying double. So it's quite a dilemma for families across Pennsylvania. And then we have the situation regarding high school athletics, where the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association has taken the position that it's going to do its own thing, although it keeps going back to the recommendations of the governor. But more recently, as we've discussed, it looks like the governor has now removed from his guidelines this limitation on the type of individuals who can attend high school sporting events. So in his earlier recommendations, as we've discussed, it was only student athletes, coaches, officials, and staff only. Visitors and spectators were prohibited from attending in-person sports-related activities. According to the governor's guidelines, that's now been rescinded in the new revised version. So parents are happy that they are now not expressly prohibited from attending their child's athletic events, and they've got a shot at it. But they've got to qualify under the numeric limits. And we've got 25 indoor, a limit of 25 individuals indoor and 250 individuals out of doors. Those are the limits. And so how is this going to happen? Are parents going to abide by those limits? Are they going to allow themselves to be turned away from participating in their own child's athletic activity? We shall see how this story ends. But the story is upon us as we speak. And so, and we've talked about how we've had political leaders from Governor Wolf to Nancy Pelosi and others simply ignore these stay-at-home orders, these business closure orders, these mask orders, and these various restrictions that they have imposed on all of us. We saw the mayor of Chicago much earlier during the pandemic, during the shutdown there, when salons across Chicago were shut down. Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago, she managed to have her hair styled by her stylist. And so it continues where those in power maintain the power, and those of us not in power must be subject to their will. And we've seen schools and colleges resume this late summer and early fall. We've seen reports of a number of incidents involving the contraction of COVID-19 at various colleges and universities in Pennsylvania. And we've seen schools and universities shutting down as a result of that. And that is the most absurd thing, considering young people are almost immune from serious adverse consequences to this illness. Young people are by and large healthy and strong and suffer almost no adverse health consequences to the coronavirus. Yet you see a mass hysteria and overreaction by those who have the power to shut things down. And wouldn't it be nice if those who were actually paying for the government, those who are actually paying for the schools, those who are actually paying for the colleges and universities, that is us, wouldn't it be nice if we had the power, if we had the power to actually call the shots in the institutions that we are supposed to be governing through self-governance or influencing through the fact that we're paying the bill. And I guess that's just a dream these days. And we still have to live under the rule of those in power, even though the science is overwhelmingly against their position that this is the type of illness that affects large numbers of healthy people. It's deadly. That's not the case. The coronavirus is not the bubonic plague, and that has been our experience since day one. But our elected leaders can't seem to see the science. Instead, it's just hysteria. And that's all we have this Saturday, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Tune in every Saturday at 1 p.m. Once again, thanks for listening, and have a wonderful Labor Day weekend.